So we're gonna continue in our series called The Away Team, and I just want to kind of set this up today by saying if you were on a football team and you made the team, you got drafted, whatever, and you got the uniform and everything, and you show up on the field, you get to enter in, take the field with the rest of the team, but then you're sitting on the bench. Okay, maybe you take the attitude, I'm riding the bench, so I'm just going to kind of do what I want to do. I'm gonna play, flip the bottle. I'm gonna, flirt with people in the stands. I'm gonna scroll on my phone. Whatever that is, even though you're on the team and you're sitting on the bench, even though you're there, you're not engaged at all. So if your opposing team were to kind of see you doing that, would they feel like you're a threat? No, the answer's simple. They're not going to consider you at all. They're not worried about what you or what contribution you're going to make to the game. If, on the other hand, you're dressed out and you are a significant player, right? You're somebody that's going to get out there and make plays and make things happen, and you're not distracted by anything. You're not looking at people in the stands. You're not on your phone, but instead you pose a real threat to the opposing team. Are they concerned about you? Well, yeah. I mean, this stands to reason. This is simple logic, right? They're going to do anything they can to stop you, right? So if I'm on the opposing team, even if I'm the home team and you're the away team, I'm going to heckle you, right? The fans are going to insult you. The crowd is going to boo you. And we are going to celebrate every time you mess up or stumble or blow a play, right? It's very simple to understand. And yet, I want you to understand, too, that this is the same thing spiritually. When it comes to our spiritual lives, we are on Team Jesus. If you believe in Jesus, then you have put on the jersey, right, of the team of Jesus. But you're sitting on the bench. You're not engaged. You're distracted by all kinds of other things. Then you are not a threat. Right, and this can happen. You could be on Team Jesus, right? You can wear the jersey, but you're not in the game, and so you'll come to church every now and then. You'll kind of participate a little bit. You'll show up to the game, but you're not engaged, and you're certainly not participating in the offense. And so you don't pose a threat to your spiritual enemy either. And it's going to be easy to kind of be distracted. If on the other hand, you're living for Jesus and you're demonstrating different values and priorities and you're responding to those who oppose you with humility, those who criticize you with respect and gentleness, guess what? You will be attacked. This is just what we're talking about in the series called The Away Team. We've been looking at what it's like for Christians to live in a culture that does not embrace the same belief or values. What does it look like? How do we live and work and influence the culture around us as Christians when we don't represent the majority? Peter, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples, became a significant leader and apostle in the early church, and he wrote a letter to Christians who were living in a society just like that in the first century. Right? Christians were not representation of the culture around them. In fact, the culture was very opposed to their beliefs. They had different beliefs about God. In fact, they believed in many gods, not just one true God. And they had different values altogether. And in many cases, the Roman Empire actually ostracized and persecuted the early church. And in 1 Peter chapter 4, where we're going to be today, I just kind of want to catch you up to what Peter's been saying. He's been saying over and over again in this letter to those Christians in the first century, listen, this is not your home anymore. I know you were born here. I know that this is familiar. I know you've still got family and friends that are part of this culture, but when you decided to become a Christian, you became a foreigner in this culture. You've been set apart. You've been called to be different, and holy is the word that he uses. And so today I want to bring you to what I believe is very possibly the most encouraging message about this that you probably never wanted to hear. Most encouraging message that you didn't plan on or hope to hear, and that is, what does Jesus promise us as Christians? Well, here's something I can start with. I can start with some things Jesus didn't promise us. For some of you, this might be a little bit of a letdown. First of all, here's some things Jesus never promised. He never promised that everybody who follows him would be rich. Sorry. He never promised that everybody who follows him would be healthy. He never promised that it's not going to rain when you go on vacation. He never promised that you're not going to get your heart broken by somebody that you're dating. Jesus never promised your plumbing wouldn't back up or that your car wouldn't break down. Jesus didn't promise those things, but here is something he did promise us. You can take it to the bank. If you are a faithful follower of Jesus, if you are set apart, if you are living different in your culture, Jesus promised us that our world would hate us and persecute us. This is what Jesus said in John 15 and various other places. He said in John 15, verses 18 and 20, he said, if the world hates you, keep in mind they hated me too. And if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And so in chapter 4, it begins with Peter telling us, listen, you got to get in the game, but when you do, you're going to face some opposition. You got to leave your past behind you, even if that makes things more difficult. And so this is what he's saying, beginning in verse 3 is where we're going to pick up. He says, you've spent enough time in the past doing what pagans chose to do. You can underline that word pagans because this word has fallen into a bit of disuse in our culture. We don't really talk about people as being pagans. It's a weird thing to say. But what we mean is people who don't believe in the one true God, the biblical God, that don't believe Jesus is the Christ, right? The people that are living opposed to God's values. That's all that means, right? Somebody who's far from God is by this definition pagan. So what is he saying? You, as somebody who's come out of that culture, out of that world, into faith in Jesus, don't live like that anymore. And then he gives some examples of what that was like. And he says, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. Now, before you knew Jesus, Peter says, you used to do the same things everybody else did. You looked like everybody else looks. You participated in all the same things that your culture participated in because you were a part of that culture. And listen, I think it's easy enough, especially starting with a verse like this, to look at this list of like sort of detestable things and say, oh, well, I don't do any of that. I mean orgies, you know, and debauchery. Like I don't participate in that. And so it's easy to sort of take this moral high horse position. And as Christians say, well, this characterizes the world around us, and I don't do any of these things. Well, just remember, these were just examples. And these were things that those Christians had participated in. And honestly, not everything on this list is quite so far-fetched. I mean, he does include drunkenness. Right? We're not going to do a show of hands, but anybody been drunk? Anybody still drunk this morning? All right. Or carousing, you know, there's just this sort of drunken participation in what's going on. You know, you're feasting, you're partying. And maybe that's not a characteristic of your life, but maybe you feast on internet porn or you celebrate with mind-altering drugs. I don't know. What about idolatry? I mean, this one hits close to home. This is just simply characterized as anything that we worship. Materialism, for that matter. We worship the latest version of our phones, or we bow down to the new car payment. I don't think the point that Peter is making is trying to point out behavior that is bizarre because it falls outside of God's standards. Listen to me. I think what Peter is saying is you have to be done living exactly like the culture around you. The people who don't share your faith, do you look and act and speak exactly the same way that they do? A culture that operates on the assumption that comfort is life's greatest good. Now listen, this hits close to home because our culture values the path of least resistance. I just want to live so that I'm comfortable. I want to make life good. I want to be happy. What could be wrong with that? If we look the same and value the same things as the culture around us who doesn't believe in Jesus, then it's like we're sitting on the bench. We're not going to face any opposition, not because the world is not difficult. We're not going to face opposition because we're not living distinctively. And so this is what he says, verse 4. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. Who is they? This is all your old friends, all the people who knew you before you knew Jesus, or at least the people who knew you before you started taking Jesus seriously and started doing things because of your faith in Jesus that made you look different. You got any people like that in your life? This is where he says, listen, people are going to think you're nuts because you don't live exactly the way they did, or that you don't live the same way that you used to. And I want to demystify some of this. You remember when Jesus told the story about the prodigal son? He said this one son went to his dad and demanded his inheritance early. And the Bible says, Jesus says, he went off to a distant land and he spent all that he had on wild living. Right? This is the same verse here that's being used, reckless wild living. It's not considering what's really at stake. So you don't have to consider something to be super immoral or even out of the norm with culture. It's just simply the idea that you could be irresponsible and short-sighted in the way that you live. Wild living could be as simple as irresponsible finances, taking on too much debt, sacrificing your family in order to get ahead at work. It could be consuming the same entertainment our culture consumes, or embracing the same moral evolution that our culture embraces, or being just as shallow and contentious on social media as our culture and society is. So your friends who don't know Jesus as Lord are going to be surprised when you and I don't do what they do. And just so we're all on the same page, right? Christians are called to be the weird ones. We're called to be people who are different from the culture around us, right? And people who don't share our faith expect certain things from you and me. Even when we claim to be Christians, they expect certain things from me. And the question for you and for me is, are we engaged in this? Are we paying attention? Are we living for Jesus? Or are we just kind of being spectators of our own life and our own culture and being very, very passive? Do we cave to the pressure to fit in and take the path of least resistance? We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to make a fuss. What Peter says, when you start living distinctively, it's going to invite some criticism. People are going to be surprised that you're acting so different. So let me give some examples just to kind of put us all in the same boat, okay? Your non-Christian friends and neighbors will be surprised if you and I as Christians don't jump on their political bandwagon or pull for their favorite candidate in a couple weeks. Our culture will be surprised when we don't adopt their terminology for gender or sexuality. Your non-Christian friends will be surprised when you don't follow YouTube and Instagram, Facebook influencers, right? Instead, we look to the Bible and we say, this is what's going to set us apart. The non-believing world will be surprised when we don't let our kids participate in sports on Sundays because our family makes worship a priority. People will be surprised when you claim to follow Jesus, but you don't want to legalize pot. Or you don't have a smartphone anymore because you found that it was increasing your opportunity to look at internet porn, and you decide to get sober from that. They'll think you're weird when you decide not to move in together before you get married. They'll think you're weird when you don't file for divorce when your spouse has cheated on you. They will be surprised when you don't get freaked out by the news every day that tells you about inflation or dips in the stock market. They were going to be surprised when a Christian doesn't like country music. Do we have everybody now? I hope. Maybe most of all, I think our society would be surprised when you and I, who claim to be Christians, don't turn out to be mean, narrow-minded, bigoted people that they thought all Christians were. They'll be surprised. What is it that you do that surprises people? Anything? Maybe it's that you don't give your daughter a cell phone until she turns 15. Maybe it's that, hey, you're a Christian and you actually tip on Sundays? Wow. There's a whole message there. I can't believe that's still a thing. Anyway, tip people or go home and eat. That's all I'm going to say. All right, there you go. Never even been a server. Some of you have. Anyway, when your kids make a mess in the restaurant that you decide to go to and you ask for a mop or a rag to clean up, the mess behind you. Man, the world notices. That was literally a conversation I had with a server this week. There are a whole lot more things that I could say about these verses, but here's what I want us to focus on today. You and I are either in the game or we are not. We either stand out and we pose a threat, or we don't to our spiritual enemy. And if we don't pose a threat, we're not living distinctively, then it's going to feel like we don't have any resistance. It's going to feel like everything's fine. It's going to seem like all this stuff that Peter is saying is unnecessary warnings. But what Peter is saying is, listen, when you decided to follow Jesus, you drew a figurative line in the sand. When you put your faith in him, repented of sin, and were washed in baptism, you said, I'm never going back. And so he says, don't go back to that. Don't go backwards. You stay in the fight. You stay on the front lines. And your enemy is going to try to goad you into coming back and try to get you out of the game. But no, you stay in the fight. And quickly, I just want to look at some of the other things that he says right after that. Listen, in verse 7, he says, the end of all things is near. By the way, some of you guys are really interested in like end times things or prophecy or what we call eschatology. According to Peter, right here, are we in the end times? Yes, we are. It's clear, crystal clear. The end of all things is near. That's what he says, right now, imminent. So according to Peter, have we been in the end times for the last 1900 plus years? Yes, according to the Bible, not what you saw on TV or some weird History Channel thing, right? According to the Bible, we are living in the end times. So what should you and I do about that? He says, therefore, right, because of that, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. And above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. What should we do in considering that, man, this could be the end of the world? Well, have your wits about you. Be in the game, be attentive, and pray, right? Pray about it. I'm going to say it again. He didn't say post about it. He said pray about it, okay? And then most of all, he says love one another, right? Love one another. Why? Because that covers over a multitude of sins. You know what love does? Love is able to overlook an offense. Love is able to overlook people when they fall short of God's standards. Love is able to show somebody their worth, even if they don't even know their own worth. It's able to show somebody how much God loves them, even if they don't know that. Even if they don't live like that. Love covers over a multitude of sins. And then he says this, verse 9, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. So hospitality literally means to love and embrace somebody who's an outsider, not just an insider. All right, anybody heard of the word, you've heard of the word xenophobia or a xenophobe? You've heard of xenophobe, right? Somebody that's afraid of people that aren't like them, right? This is a word that gets tossed around. It's like just a little short of calling somebody racist, you call them a xenophobe. You say you don't like people who are like you, or you don't like people who are from another country living here, or whatever. It gets tossed around a lot. Do you know what the word for hospitality is here? You don't, do you? Anyway, I forgot to. No, I'm just kidding. It comes from xenophilia or philoxenos. It means a lover or a friend of strangers. In other words, the Christians are supposed to be characterized by the opposite of that. We're supposed to be characterized by loving people who are different from us. Or let me be real crystal clear. This is not a verse that says you need to love other Christians and church people. He's telling us we need to show love and affection and affinity to people even when they don't believe what we believe. And some of you were cool with it when it was like love each other and you thought that meant just other Christians. But now this has got you squirmy-gurmy, okay? Love them. Love people who are different from you. Verse 10, each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. How many of us who are Christians have received gifts that we can use to serve and love other people? All of us. We've all received at least one gift, right, according to this. And when we do that, it demonstrates God's grace, right? It's not deserved serving. We're not helping people just because they do stuff back for us. So scratch your back, you scratch mine. No, it's demonstrating grace even when they don't deserve it. And so then he says, if anybody speaks, you should do as one who speaks the very words of God. If anybody serves, you should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. Why do we do stuff? It's so that one day people will recognize, hey, you're different and you are showing a love that I want to know more about. I want to understand what's motivating you, and we want to do this so that God gets the credit. so that Jesus gets loved and thanked, so that people come to know him because of the way that we treat them. And man, if we're successful in doing this, believe it, that's different from the world around. It's certainly different than the way that people expect Christians to behave. And so you've got gifts and talents. You're called to use them. And not just at church. Listen, we always need volunteers at church, okay? We will always need you. If there's any doubt in your mind that there is a role for you to serve here at the church, let me eliminate that doubt. There definitely is. But that's just like one day a week. That's like half a day a week. That's like a couple hours, right, a week. There's 6.5 other days. Who are the people God's put in your life that he wants you to serve so that they'll come to know Jesus? Right? They're in your house. They're in your workplace. They're at your school or your kid's school. They're in your community. Who are those people? And if you've got gifts and talents, but you're not using them to make Jesus famous, to bring glory to God, then guess what? You're sitting on the bench. So let me just run over a couple. If you've got what you need to pay your bills and to eat and all those kind of things, God's blessed you financially, and you're not giving generously. Maybe, you give a tip here and there, fine, yeah. But you're not strategically, prayerfully, sacrificially giving to ministry, then what are we doing? You're certainly not a threat to the enemy. We're not making generous gifts that are going to make a difference in this world. We're not using our time, talent, and resources to influence our culture for Jesus. Get in the game. Are you believe in Jesus, but you're not representing him boldly? You haven't invited somebody to church? You haven't had a friend out for coffee or breakfast to share your faith with them? What are we doing? It's like we got the jersey on, but we're sitting on the bench. And when we do that, our enemy takes no notice of us. Listen, if we're going to live the way that Jesus has called us to live, that Peter is echoing here that we're supposed to call to live, we're going to face opposition. If you're not facing opposition, it's time to get in the game. And not opposition for being a jerk, right? Opposition for being like Jesus. Opposition for loving people. Opposition for living and demonstrating light in the darkness. Because, man, when you shine light on what's done in the darkness, people start getting a little uncomfortable. They start feeling ashamed. And they want to take that out on you and me. This is not deserved shame. It's like we act like a jerk in traffic. Well, then we get what we deserve, okay? And so all this is leading up to Peter saying this, and I think this is really maybe the kind of the key verse of the text, verse 12. He says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though something strange were happening to you." Don't be surprised when you face opposition. In fact, if anything, he's implying you should be surprised when you're not facing opposition. Don't be surprised when you do. Don't be surprised that if you're set apart and you're different. Don't be shocked when you're criticized or ridiculed because of your faith. It's kind of like imagining a warrior, a soldier going into battle, and he gets into the battle and the firefight, and he says to his commanding officer, "Sir, they're shooting at us." And the sergeant's like, "What'd you expect? Right? We're at war." And maybe that's the message that we haven't shared. Christianity is not a playground, it's a battleground. Listen, I'm all about making our experience here on Sunday morning fun and enjoyable. Man, I love that. I want it to be. I want it to be something that strengthens and refreshes us every week. It ought to be a great time and a celebration together. But you know that that's not all the Christian life is. It's not just a party. It's not just fun. We're in a fight. When you engage in battle, you're going to face opposition every single time. And so it brings up a warning. If you've never faced opposition, maybe it's because you're not engaging in the fight. Now, when Peter says you're going to face trials that are fiery, it's possible he was being very literal. Okay, we can go back to the very first week and kind of introduce all this. Rome at this time had an emperor named Nero. Nero was a pretty wicked guy, killed all kinds of people, was very murderous. In fact, he was such a sort of egomaniac, wanted to put his fingerprint on all the buildings in Rome, and the Senate had turned him down over and over again for building new buildings. So he just set fire, allegedly, to the whole city of Rome. And it burned for days on end and destroyed a lot of the buildings. And ultimately his plan was, I want to destroy it so I can rebuild it in my image. But he needed a scapegoat. He needed to blame somebody. So he blamed these sort of religious deviants, these followers of Jesus, these little Christians. And Christianity became the scapegoat for what Nero was doing. And so people started lashing out at this group of people in society increasingly and increasingly. And ultimately, when Peter says, listen, don't be surprised at the fiery trial you're facing as if it was something strange, what I think he's quite literally saying is, listen, there were times that Christians' homes were burned. There were times that Christians were burned at the stake. And Nero specifically was known to dip Christians in hot wax and put them on a tree and light them on fire in his courtyard to entertain his guests at the suffering and dying of these people who trusted Jesus. And Peter writes to Christians who are experiencing that kind of opposition and says, hey, don't be surprised by that. Really? And maybe this is what it is. Maybe the idea of persecution is sort of so removed from our minds that we just don't identify ourselves when we're going through it or when we're trying to face it. Okay? Now, let me also say persecution is real. More Christians are losing their life in the last 30 years than in the previous 1900 years. I know that's hard to believe, but worldwide, there are places in the world where you will lose everything if you choose to follow Jesus, and that's still active, and we need to be aware of that. But in our culture, that's not our everyday experience. Does that mean that it's any less detrimental to what we're trying to do? Elliot Clark says, for most part, we aren't in danger of being imprisoned or tortured in our culture. Rather, we face being ignored and excluded. Lean into this, because we face ridicule and reviling. If we open our mouths with the gospel, we run the risk of others thinking we're closed-minded and unloving. And at least, oftentimes in my own life, where the potential there for so much shame, the possibility of being made an outsider, hinders how bold I want to live. So he continues, he says, the reality is feelings of shame and abandonment are among the most difficult to face. It may not be overt persecution that crushes our spirits or tamps down our witness. It could simply be the shame of having those closest to us consider us to be foolish or ignorant, arrogant or misguided, or just a prude. It could be the threat of isolation or being perpetually uninvited to things, or unrecognized, unwanted. So shame and the fear of exclusion combine like nothing else to quench our spirit. Listen, in our culture, persecution can be real, and wants to see it for what it is, right? Don't be surprised when it happens. I think if Peter were talking to our audience, he'd say to the college girl, freshman going to a university, don't be surprised you don't get a second date because of your stance on purity. He'd say to maybe one of us, don't be surprised when your family starts making fun of you at Thanksgiving. Don't be surprised, Peter says, at the fiery trial you're experiencing because you're in the game. You're engaged. You're on the front lines. You're making a difference. You're rattling the darkness of hell. Don't be surprised when you face opposition. Instead, what does he say we should do? Verse 13, rejoice. Have joy. Because, or inasmuch, as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you're insulted because of the name of Christ, you're blessed. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Is that different or what? Be glad. Be thankful when you experience opposition and persecution for your faith. Why? Because you're partnering with Jesus. Now here's the thing. This is what's so backwards and turned around. We think that joy is wrapped up in comfort because, secret clue in, that's what our culture teaches. We think joy is about comfortable circumstances. Peter's telling us, did you know actually joy comes when you identify more and more with Jesus? And in order to identify with Jesus, we have to identify with his suffering. You won't understand or appreciate or know how loved and valued you are until you start experiencing what Jesus experienced. And then it dawns on you, he did this for me. Throughout history of the world, Christians have been made to experience all kinds of suffering, and yet in the midst of suffering, experiencing incomprehensible joy during the reign of the Soviet Union and communism. There were a lot of people, especially in the country of Romania, right, including many Christians who were tortured as criminals of the state. Many prisoners would be chained to the floor, forced to stand naked, upright all day on the bare, cold stone floor, or sometimes with your feet immersed in icy water, like just to add misery. One such political prisoner was named Richard Wurmbrand, and he was a Jewish man turned Christian minister. And ultimately, he was released and later went on to share his story and founded an organization, a Christian organization called the Voice of the Martyrs. But one of his memories from that time that he spent in jail is fitting. He says, "I was strictly forbidden to preach to other prisoners. It was understood that whoever was caught doing this received a severe beating, and a number of us decided to pay the price for the privilege of preaching. So we accepted their terms. It was a deal. We preached, and they beat us. We were happy preaching, they were happy beating us, so everyone was happy." How is it that opposition and suffering and persecution could bring about joy? Well, let me give you a few peeks into that reality. First of all, we need to understand when you experience opposition and persecution, you begin to relate to Jesus better in a way you never can without that. When you hurt, you can more appreciate and deeply understand what Jesus endured on your behalf. When you suffer physical pain, you can identify with the excruciating pain Jesus went through when he was nailed to a cross and wore a crown of thorns on his head. When you suffer emotional stress, you can begin to imagine, what did Jesus endure, right? He suffered daily stress. He was encountered by hostile crowds and slow learners and incessant demands on his time, constant interruptions. It was stressful. But on top of all that, when you suffer alienated relationships, you remember it was Jesus' own brothers who mocked him, Judas who betrayed him, his closest followers who fled from him when it mattered the most. And everybody forsook him and left him alone when he was on trial. You will never understand and appreciate Jesus' love for you until you start to experience what he experienced. But also in verse 16, however, if you suffer as a Christian, again, not as being just a dingleberry, right? Instead, if you're living the way Jesus wants you to, and you suffer, don't be ashamed about that. Praise God that you bear that name. Why is it that so many of us would say, well, I just never really experienced persecution? I don't think it's necessarily your fault. I just think our culture is so convincing that our number one pursuit is comfort that we bought into it. And I'll be honest, right? I would much rather have a comfortable conversation with somebody than a full-on confrontation with somebody that I know disagrees with me. So I'll still steer clear of those subjects, right? I'd rather have a nice, easy day than to deal with the inconvenience of somebody going off on me. Comfort is something that we have so often pursued as Christians. We have baptized it and spiritualized it. And this, some of you, if this characterizes like the bulk of your prayer life, just let this sink in for a minute. All our prayers can be characterized, God, help me to have a good day. Bless us, keep us safe. Don't let anything bad happen to us. Watch over us. Bless this food, God. Help our kids. Keep us comfortable. Keep us safe. And essentially what we're saying is, God, help us avoid conflict at all costs. Let's dodge any opposition. Therefore, we're going to take the path of least resistance so we don't have to make a big impact. You think God's glad when our request is, God, help us to just not make an impact on the culture around us? Help me skate by under the radar. And so maybe the way that this looks in your life, you're at a party and you kind of give in. You drink or smoke whatever they're drinking and smoking, and you just want to fit in. It's not that big a deal, right? Or maybe this is you. You don't correct somebody when they say something offensive or racist or sexist in front of you. You know it's wrong, but you don't want to be uncomfortable. You don't want to make things awkward, so you just don't say anything. You laugh along. Or maybe somebody asks you, "Are you a follower of Jesus?" And you kind of cave, and you're like, "Well, yeah, but I don't like force my beliefs on anybody." Because you'd rather not just like come out and lead with that. You don't want to make things awkward. You want to be that guy. be the target of insults or criticism, and it's because we're pursuing comfort. And that's what our culture says, right? That's what we're supposed to pursue. We all want to be happy. So we pursue comfort that forces us in many ways to avoid opposition. We don't want to upset anybody. We don't want to make anybody mad. And we just want to have a good day. And so the problem is we avoid opposition to the point that it weakens our faith. We don't depend on God anymore. We can just do this on our own. So we're not standing for anything. We're not passionate about much. And so for some reason, we get there. And when we get what we've asked for, when we have this comfort and we have this safety, and we find out when we get there, we feel empty. I've pursued all this stuff. I'm trying to avoid anything difficult, and I just don't feel satisfied. Why don't I feel close to Jesus? Why do I feel like God is so distant? It's because Peter has called us to live differently. The only way that you really live differently is when you recognize you're a foreigner in this world, you're a stranger, you're a pilgrim, you're a sojourner. All these are the words that Peter used. You're just passing through. And so your evaluation of life, your greatest good, your highest pursuit is no longer comfort, it's Jesus. And when we pursue Jesus, we face opposition. When we live differently for him, we receive criticism. And when we live for him, we have different values than our culture does around him. Because Jesus teaches us to love people even when they directly hate you. That we love them. He teaches us to give even if people take advantage of us. He teaches us to turn the other cheek even when we're insulted or wounded. He teaches us that if somebody asks for a shirt, you give them your jacket too. He teaches us to be radically and completely different from the world around us. And this is the most encouraging message you didn't want to hear. Why? Because if you're in the game, you're making a difference. And when you're making a difference, you will face opposition. And when you face opposition, it will strengthen your faith. Right? Because there's something about having to live out there different from everybody else that makes you depend on God. It makes you pray every day. How am I going to do this? It makes you read the Bible, right? And man, I got to be close to God. And oh my goodness, now that I'm facing all this opposition, I'm on my knees and I feel closer to God than I ever have. How did that happen? Right? The Bible is alive to me. It's guidance for me every day. Suddenly you find yourself living more boldly than you ever did before. Why? Because the opposition actually has a way of refining us and testing to see if what we really claim to believe is real. And so verse 19, this is probably the sort of the best verse in the whole passage here. Peter says, so then those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. If you're suffering, if you're experiencing opposition, pushback, ostracized, you know, remember, God's never going to leave you, forsake you. If you're doing what is right, you trust God that he's going to bring about the outcome. He's the one who loves you. He's the one that cares for you. He's never, ever going to fail you. So here's the principle, really simple. Try to live by. I don't always get this right. But hopefully this speaks to some of us in every area of your life, whether it's your family or your finances or your relationships or your parenting or your work life or wherever you're feeling peer pressure or any area of your life, right? Do what's right and trust God with the results. Do what's right and trust God with the results. And hopefully this speaks to some of you, right? Because what do we do? How do we live, right? As Jesus' followers, we're no longer making comfort the highest pursuit. We're going to say, you know what? I'll cast aside comfort if it means that I'm living for Jesus. And here's the thing. I'm not afraid of a little persecution. Some of you are really worried that our culture is going to get further and further from Jesus. Guess what? That's going to happen. And I'm not afraid of that. It might be a good thing for the church. Do you know why? Because persecution weeds out the fake Christians. It is very easy in our culture today to claim to be a Christian and not be one. That's the biggest danger for the church. Is that we think we're on the team, but we're really just riding the bench. We're no threat at all. And when opposition comes, it's going to refine some of us into having real, genuine faith. a little bit of persecution adds some stakes to the game. It's going to get people to be really serious about what they claim to believe. And I'll be honest, I don't think that's a bad thing. So bring it on, whatever happens. I'm not going to be on the bench. I hope you'll say the same thing. I'm going to get in the game. I'm going to be on the front lines. I'm going to serve with my church. I'm going to give generously. I want to be obedient to the voice of God. And I'm not going to just watch what's happening in our world. I'm going to engage. I'm going to be a follower of Jesus. I'm going to step up and I'm going to pray. I'm going to read the Bible. I'm going to do what God says to do. And I'm going to trust him with the outcome. And if things get difficult, I'm going to come to understand a joy that I would never have otherwise. Because I'm going to know all that Jesus did for me. That's my prayer. If that's your prayer too, will you join me in prayer? Father, I confess this is me as a preacher here. I spent a lot of my life living for comfort. Lord, I pray that as you convict me in your word today, as I stand up here and preach things that I need to hear, I pray that you're doing that for all of us, that we will seize the opportunity before us to influence our families, friends and neighbors. God, to show them that we really mean what we say we believe. We're going to throw some of the caution to the wind. We're going to love recklessly, and we're going to be generous, kind people, even in the face of persecution. And maybe once again, the world will take notice and come to know Jesus and declare him as Lord. God, what an amazing opportunity we have to shine the light in the darkness. And that has a way of exposing things that people aren't proud of. God, I pray that we don't relish in that. Our job's not to point the finger. It's just to shine light so that people come to the light. To offer the grace of Jesus that promises to wash us clean of all of our sin and give us a brand new life. We don't have to live in shame anymore. Christianity is not about guilt. It's about freedom. So God, I pray that we'll live in that freedom that you've given us, and I pray that we'll proclaim it to everybody. Help us overcome our inhibitions, our fear about being alienated. Help us to be more afraid of our loved ones not making it into the church, into a relationship with Jesus. God, I want to pray right now for our church, and we pray for anybody that's never really stepped across that line of faith to be ready to do that. God, to know that this is challenging. The pitch is come join this team so we can get beat up on by our world. So it's not a challenge for the faint of heart. But what's our alternative, God? You alone, as the disciples said, you alone have the words of life. So we come to you. You go fight the battle for us. You be our defender. Help us just praise you and live for you, and you fight the battle. So God, anybody that's not made the decision to follow you, I pray that they would do that. I pray that anybody that's just fighting a battle, and they need to know they're not alone today. God, the church is here. I pray that they come back, and we can pray beside them. We can serve them. We can come alongside and say, listen, we got your back. And Father, for the rest of us, that we'll lean in, that we'll get in the game, and if we take the hits, it'll just help us to know how valued we are when Jesus suffered for us. Lead us in that time, this time of response, in the next few minutes. God, do your work among our church. Even if people are watching online, I pray that they'd reach out, connect with us today. I pray all this in the name of your Son, Jesus.